Imagine for a moment that every explanation you give is a small withdrawal from your account of credibility, confidence, and calm. Notice how when you start explaining, your voice gets softer, your shoulders drop, and the other person's attention shifts from what you did to why you did it. You think you're closing a gap, but you're actually widening the space where doubt and negotiation live. If you want to be seen as decisive, consistent, and quietly powerful, the single most radical move you can make is to explain less and let what you produce, your work, your results, your behavior, be the argument that follows you. This is easier said than done, and not for the reasons you expect. Picture a scene you know well, a meeting where someone defends a choice they already made, or a relationship conversation that spirals because one person keeps offering justifications, or a social post where you feel compelled to give a backstory after 3 people asked why. In each case, the explanation acts like a leash. You tether yourself to the other person's judgment and you make your own identity negotiable. The more you try to fix what's being perceived in that moment with words, the more you create a future where your actions require translation. But it's an endless second guess, and the urge to explain is not only social, it's biological. Your brain treats social rejection and misunderstanding like a primitive danger signal. When someone questions you, parts of your limbic system light up the same way they would if you were physically threatened. Explaining becomes a fast, instinctive response like a flinch designed to reduce social pain. But instincts evolved for survival, not for modern reputation management. And what once protected tribes can now erode the quiet strength you want. There's also a chemical flavor to this pull. Validation activates reward circuits, dopamine spikes when someone accepts or approves of you, and explanations often aim for that tiny hit someone nods, buys your reason. The anxiety drops. Over time, you build an addictive loop where explanation equals relief, and that relief costs you something subtler than momentary calm. It trains you to prioritize others' opinions over your internal compass. Your nervous system learns to seek permission instead of cultivating certainty. Social status dynamics make it worse. In any group, the person who feels the least need to justify is often read as most secure and authoritative. Status is not merely about loudness or visibility. It's about perceived autonomy. When you explain, you implicitly acknowledge that your actions require approval. That subtle admission signals lower autonomy and invites power plays. Understanding status is about decoding why silence can sometimes be louder than the strongest defense. Stoic thinkers noticed this centuries ago in different language. They taught that you should be concerned with the quality of your actions, not the world's assessment of them. When a Stoic says, worry only about what is within your control, that includes the compulsive explanations you give to manage opinions. Practicing silence in the face of critique isn't passive resignation. It's an active redirection of energy back to what you can actually change: your work, your habits, your responses. Emotional intelligence reframes the choice to explain as a discipline of self-regulation. You can feel the discomfort of being misunderstood and still choose not to react. That pause, intentional, composed, signals to others that you are the kind of person who measures your response against principles rather than impulses. Self-regulation, not rhetoric, becomes the primary currency of influence. This is how you move from being an explainer to being an exemplar. Communication experts will tell you that explanations are often a form of negotiation over meaning. When you supply a reason, you hand someone the tool to argue with you. Each justification becomes a hinge on which debate can swing. If you want to avoid being dragged into endless rebuttals, stop handing over the metaphorical keys. Let your achievements lock the door for you. Let the work speak in the voice you cannot match with words. There's a paradox in perception. The more you try to clarify your identity with a stream of explanations, the more brittle that identity appears. People start to ask, why are they saying so much? Suspicion creeps in because humans are wired to interpret over-clarification as a cover-up, or at least as insecurity. Being over-explanatory creates the illusion of complexity where there may be none, and that illusion invites people to poke for inconsistencies. Think about situations where silence actually elevated someone. A decisive CEO who made a controversial move and then let the numbers prove the rationale. A teammate who responded to criticism with unbothered competence. Or an artist whose work rewrote public opinion without lengthy interviews. These are not accidents of temperament, but deliberate learned strategies of restraint. The world will often interpret restraint as confidence, and confidence is contagious in a room. In relationships, explanations can be particularly corrosive because they convert intimacy into negotiation. When you explain yourself to a partner, you're implicitly saying, my identity depends on whether you accept this version of me. That dynamic sets up a tiny ecosystem where acceptance becomes conditional. Paradoxically, the more you seek to secure emotional safety with words, the less you may actually achieve it because you make your partner the gatekeeper of your self-definition. Delve deeper into the personality patterns, and you find a recognizable profile. People with fragile self-worth tend to over-explain as a way of collecting external validation, while those with secure self-concept rarely feel the need to justify their choices. This isn't moralizing, it's diagnostic. If you find yourself explaining to make others comfortable, you might be compensating for internal deficit of certainty. Recognizing that is the first real step toward changing the habit. Explanations also create commitments that can trap you later. Every time you explain, you narrate your past choices in a certain light, and narratives have momentum. They become expectations people hold you to. If you later wish to pivot, those earlier explanations become evidence against the change. This psychological entrenchment is why the impulse to justify decisions, though natural, builds a scaffolding that can make future flexibility more difficult. Social media intensifies all of this. Platforms reward constant contextualization. Posts beg for comments. Replies invite clarifications. And algorithms prioritize engagement. You learn quickly that explaining generates interaction, and interaction looks like relevance. But relevance that depends on continuous justification is a brittle form of presence. Real influence is not a viral thread of explanations. It is a pattern of consistent behavior people can rely on without daily footnotes. From a cognitive load perspective, explanations are expensive. Every reason you give requires attention, retrieval of facts, emotional labor, and subsequent monitoring of the listener's response. Those are mental resources siphoned away from productive tasks. If your daily life feels like a series of apologetic clarifications, your brain is busy managing impressions instead of creating value. That chronic diversion is stealthy and accumulative in its cost. There's also a social cascade effect. Once someone explains themselves, conversation often shifts from the original topic to discussing the explanation itself. The map changes. You no longer control the narrative because you've ceded it to the dynamics of debate. Others who might be allies become critics, and neutral observers get seduced into asking follow-ups. Statements beget questions, and questions beg answers. The simple act of explaining is often the opening move in a much longer, draining exchange. Now consider the idea of signal versus noise. Success is a clear signal. Explanations are noise. Signals cut through uncertainty because they are observable and measurable. Noise distracts from outcomes with stories and reasons. If your primary goal is to be judged by results, you need to treat explanations like static. The paradox is that by trying to make your intentions transparent, you can obscure the actual signal of what you produced. Let me tell you about someone I know, a creative who spent years defending every project, every late deadline, every choice in public forums and private messages. The energy lost in defending her process made people focus on her process rather than the work. Then she made a quiet decision, finish, publish, and stop narrating. Within a year, her work began to speak louder than her explanations ever had, and doors opened that had been previously closed. The transformation did not come from arrogance. It came from the disciplined decision to stop negotiating her worth in the court of public opinion. Try a small thought experiment. Imagine what would change if you removed explanation as a reflex and made it a deliberate choice. Notice how many situations evaporate because your need for consent was the only fuel keeping them alive. You'll realize that some relationships, jobs, or debates survive only because you continuously prop them up with justification. That awareness is unsettling because it asks you to consider which parts of your life are built on solid ground and which are held up by your talking. Underneath most explanations is an emotional root that's often unacknowledged fear. Fear of being judged, fear of losing connection, fear of being misunderstood. But fear and transparency are not the same. When you expose your fear through endless justification, you transform vulnerability into a bargaining chip. Vulnerability can build intimacy when shared honestly and sparingly. When overused as explanation, it becomes a performance that cheapens both the emotion and the relationship. Neuroscience gives us another useful lens: human brains mirror. We're wired to pick up cues from others and match them. When you explain defensively, that defensive posture emits signals, micro-expressions, hesitant language, qualifiers that others mirror, and suddenly the room feels uncertain, tentative, and defensive back at you. Conversely, clear actions create stable neural patterns in observers. They see you as reliable and predictable, which breeds comfort and trust without the need for constant verbal maintenance. Boundaries live at the heart of this dynamic. When you refuse to enter into endless justifications, you're drawing a line that clarifies where your responsibility ends and someone else's expectations begin. This boundary is not walls, it's an invitation for others to observe and interpret without asking you to police every perception. Good boundaries help other people develop responsibility for their reactions instead of making you the curator of their feelings. Language habits reveal a lot. Notice how many explanations begin with hedges. I just wanted to, it's not that maybe I should have small linguistic concessions that undercut the force of your statement. These verbal habits are habits of appeasement. Replacing them with firm, concise language does more than change tone. It reprograms how people predict your behavior. The fewer hedges you use, the less people feel invited to negotiate the terms of your identity. Social reciprocity pressures complicate the choice to explain or not. If someone offers you a reason, you feel obliged to offer one back. The kinetic energy in conversations looks for equilibrium. Give an explanation, receive a counterpoint, and so on. Recognizing this pressure allows you to break the cycle intentionally by opting out. Your silence is not rude. It changes the rhythm of exchange, and that change has social consequences that can be productive. A reframe that helps is to think of explanation as currency and decide when to spend it. Spend it when your values are in question, when clarity avoids harm, or when accountability matters. Save it when the explanation serves only to soothe your anxiety or to defend a trivial choice. This mental budgeting gives you agency. You get to choose what to justify and when, which flips the script from reactive to intentional. Now, it's fair to ask, are there times when explaining is necessary? Absolutely. Transparency can be crucial in ethical dilemmas in restoring trust after real harm, or in contexts where safety depends on clear communication. The skill is discerning between necessary explanation and habitual justification. Most people, however, misapply explanation in the latter category because the immediate emotional relief feels indistinguishable from the true strategic clarity that real explanations provide. Here's a subtle social truth. People respect competence more than explanations. If your track record shows competence, then future ambiguous moments will be interpreted in light of that competence rather than your occasional justification. The trajectory of consistent behavior creates a hermeneutic bias in observers. Once you've established credibility through actions, you can afford to explain much less because people give you the benefit of the doubt. Psychological freedom arises when you stop making your worth dependent on constant interpretation by others. You reclaim your narrative by choosing to act to produce and then to let the work stand without perpetual footnotes. That freedom does not mean you ignore feedback. It simply means you stop equating every opinion with a verdict that must be answered. The scale of what deserves an answer shrinks, and you conserve energy for the projects that move the needle. There's a mental model that reframes how to approach this whole issue. Think of your life as a series of proofs rather than promises. A promise requires explanation and future reassurance. A proof exists in present reality. Shifting your mindset toward proving through output changes the economy of your interactions. You stop promising explanations and start delivering artifacts that require no defense, results, finished work, consistent behavior that do the persuasive heavy lifting on your behalf. Now, consider the social alchemy of curiosity. When you stop over-explaining, other people become curious in a different, deeper way. They have to observe, interpret, and fill in gaps by watching what you do next. That curiosity is an indirect driver of influence because it makes people engage with your actions over time rather than seeking immediate closure through verbal negotiation. Silence becomes an engine of ongoing attention rather than a surrender to the moment. There's an important paradox here that most people miss. Stopping explanations is not about withdrawal or secrecy. It's about disciplined transparency where your priorities are clear and communicated through deeds, not defense. The moment you understand that the temptation to overshare loses its power, you replace frantic justification with an elegant economy of presence. People begin to gauge you by a longer timeline, and that perspective is both rare and valuable. What follows from all of this is a counterintuitive but powerful skill cultivating the inner clarity that makes explanation unnecessary. This is not stoic suppression of emotion, but an emotional maturity that recognizes the difference between being understood and being required to perform for understanding. There's a specific cognitive switch, the way you reframe feedback and manage the reflex to respond, that transforms how you move through conversations, and it radically affects how the world receives you. The mechanics of flipping that switch are simple in outline but profound in practice, and they reveal a deeper principle about power, presence, and the quiet force of results. The cognitive switch I'm talking about doesn't flip on willpower alone. It lives in the scaffolding you build around ordinary moments. You can train your mind with implementation intentions, simple if then plans that turn reflexive explanation into a deliberate choice, so that when the urge surges, you already have a practiced alternative. This isn't moral grandstanding, it's practical architecture. Design fewer spontaneous choices and you'll respond with presence instead of panic. When you create deliberate white space between what you do and what you say, meaning has room to settle on its own. Let the moment breathe and you'll notice two things. Often the presumed crisis never materializes, and when it does, the response you provide is calmer and more useful. Think of it like letting a conversation oxidize. Some statements taste sharper once they're given time to air. You can shift other people's expectations before they ever demand your justification. Teams and communities operate by norms, and leaders who define those norms change the ecology of explanation. If you set a cadence, decisions documented, retrospective scheduled, immediate justification de-emphasized, you change the social contract. Fewer people will default to asking you to explain because the group has agreed what counts as sufficient clarity. There is a deep evolutionary logic to strategic silence. It's a reliable signal. In biology and economics, signals that are costly to fake become trustworthy. When you don't clamor for validation after every move, you implicitly signal that your confidence doesn't require constant proof. That kind of quiet is expensive to counterfeit. People notice the cost and interpret it as credibility. Ambiguity is not a void. It's a stage on which others perform their own stories about you. If you have already earned trust, ambiguity invites generous projection. If you haven't, it can invite suspicion. That means your use of silence is tactical. Cultivate credibility first so that the blank space you offer gets filled with curiosity rather than doubt. The urge to explain often traces back to attachment patterns learned early in life. People with anxious attachments use explanation to secure closeness, to buy a little more of someone's attention. People with avoidant patterns shut down and withdraw. Understanding that origin gives you a compassionate lens for change. You retrain relational instincts rather than merely suppressing them. There's a cognitive trap called the actor-observer bias that makes explanations risky. You see your actions as responses to context observers in fair, enduring character traits. When you offer explanations, you sometimes invite others to dig into cause and effect and to relabel your behavior as evidence of who you are. Saying less reduces that interrogation and keeps the focus on outcomes, not motives. Commitment through action beats commitment through argument. Behavioral science shows that when people publicly commit and follow through, observers update their beliefs based on what they see rather than what they hear. If you want to be persuasive, make visible commitments and deliver. Those tangible trails are harder to contest than a long string of reasons you gave in the heat of the moment. People make surprisingly accurate judgments from thin slices of behavior. A handful of consistent micro actions creates impressions that outweigh lengthy defenses. That's why small, steady demonstrations of competence, integrity, and consistency matter more than any single story you could tell about yourself. When under pressure, on a neurological level, the impulse to justify often hooks into the brain's rumination systems, commonly called the default mode network. That internal rehearsal feels productive because it's an attempt to manage future social risk, but it mostly amplifies anxiety. Interrupting the replay through a brief walk of breathing exercise or a concrete task prevents the mind from economizing time toward unnecessary explanations. Your capacity to resist the pull to explain is governed by executive control in the prefrontal cortex. That means it's trainable. Practices that reduce emotional reactivity, sleep, exercise, focused attention, literally strengthen the circuitry that allows you to pause, reflect, and choose a non-defensive response. People who seem unshakable have often cultivated that calm like a muscle. There is also a physiological price to chronic justification. Sustained social evaluative stress increases cortisol and accelerates allostatic load, your body's wear and tear over time. Over-explaining isn't just socially costly, it takes a toll physiologically, eroding clarity and stamina. When you stop needing to narrate every move, you conserve energy that shows up in better sleep, clearer thinking, and steadier mood. Philosophers noticed this limit long before social scientists did. Wittgenstein put it bluntly, whereof one cannot speak, thereof one must be silent. The point isn't to be obstinate, it's to recognize that language is a blunt instrument for internal states. Sometimes the words you could muster would be misleading at best, corrosive at worst. Contemplative traditions offer a complementary insight. Non-attachment reduces the need to secure identity through others' opinions. It's not emotional coldness, it's a form of inner sovereignty. When you stop treating every judgment as a verdict on your worth, your presence becomes less performative and more magnetic. Therapeutic techniques give you tools to short-circuit reflexive explanation. Cognitive, behavioral approaches teach you to identify automatic thoughts, test assumptions, and then let those thoughts pass. Metacognitive strategies, seeing your thinking as a process rather than truth, create distance. Those interventions are practical. They change the felt urgency that makes explanation feel like a life preserver. Because social media is engineered to provoke immediate responses, you can reclaim agency by designing friction into your digital life. Delay your replies, draft messages privately and revisit them the next day, or limit exposure to comment threads that make you defensive. Small structural changes to your environment remove the temptation to explain for dopamine hits. Cultural engendered socialization shape the grammar of explanation. Many women, for instance, are conditioned to offer more context and to soften statements. Many men are trained to assert. That's not an excuse, but a map once you see the patterns. You can choose a communication style that supports your goals rather than simply repeating inherited scripts. Silence reads differently across cultures. In high-context cultures, what you leave unsaid carries meaning. In low-context settings, direct explanation is the norm. If you adopt a strategy of restraint, calibrate it culturally. The same pause that commands respect in one room may read as evasiveness in another, so cultural literacy matters. Teams that require less justification do so because the work is visible and traceable. When decisions are documented, metrics are public, and rationale is logged, nobody needs to ask for a post hoc defense. You can design organizational processes that favor artifacts and outcomes over theatrical explanation. Emails, dashboards, and decision archives become the language of accountability. Silence is also a negotiation tool. A well-placed pause after you make an offer forces the other side to reveal more. People dislike emptiness and will often rush to fill it, sometimes with concessions. The silence you maintain isn't passive. It's a probe that gathers information without committing you to a premature defense. In relationships, the impulse to step into a long explanation often crowds out real repair. A brief, sincere admission combined with a concrete, observable attempt to change is more healing than an exhaustive narrative about why you acted. Actions rebuild trust in ways words cannot. When repair is prioritized, the need for explanatory theater diminishes. If you're raising children, modeling action over explanation teaches responsibility. When a child breaks something and your response focuses on making amends rather than on extracting reasons, you reinforce accountability. Modeling how to repair rather than how to justify gives them a template for maturity. In creative work and product development, audiences care about what the thing does, not the length of your justification about how you made it. Demos, prototypes, and measurable improvements create rhetorical authority in ways interviews never will. Let the artifact do the convincing. Your process can be interesting, but results are decisive. When you have a public role, explanation sometimes becomes a moral obligation. Transparency in institutions is not performative when it enables verification and prevents harm. The ethics of explanation shift depending on your level of responsibility, private silence, public accountability. Know the boundary and act accordingly. People ask for explanations for different reasons: closure, correction, validation. Emotional intelligence is the skill of discerning which motive is at play. If someone seeks closure, a concise, empathetic response often suffices. If they seek correction, offer a specific plan for behavior change. Meeting the underlying need saves both time and dignity. Treat the change as an experiment. Try choosing restraint in low-stakes situations for a week and record what happens. You'll collect data on which contexts require more explicit clarity and which reward quiet. With evidence, your approach becomes tailored and pragmatic rather than ideological. Habit change is neurobiology. The basal ganglia store routines, and repeated restraint slowly rewires the associations that used to trigger explanation. Consciously practicing pause and alternative responses creates new default pathways. Over time, the new behavior feels less like discipline and more like a new, simpler habit. Think of your reputation as a bank account. Consistent, reliable actions are deposits and explanations are withdrawals. If you have a positive balance, you can afford to spend less of your breath proving your worth. If you haven't saved words feel necessary, invest in behaviors first, and the need to spend explanations declines. When someone presses you with repeated why questions, shift the burden back, gently ask what outcome they're trying to protect or which consequence worries them. Often the interrogator wants reassurance, not truth. By reframing, you turn a potential skirmish into a diagnostic conversation and avoid spinning defensive stories that satisfy no one. Your public footprint shapes the ethics of silence. In positions of influence, withholding explanation about matters affecting others can become a political or moral act. Recognize that silence there is not a neutral option. It's a choice with consequences that must be weighed against responsibilities to others. A small, well-timed joke can diffuse tension in a way that avoids entrenching a defensive narrative. Humor signals self-possession and reduces the perceived need to over-explain. It's not evasive when used with kindness. It's a skillful redirect that preserves dignity on both sides of a conversation. When you have genuinely harmed someone, clarity and repair take precedence over clever phrasing. A concise apology that owns impact and commits to concrete correction tends to restore trust faster than a long account of mitigating circumstances. People read action far more convincingly than extended rationales for behavior. Much of your explanatory impulse comes from an internal running commentary that can be rewritten. Reparenting yourself, providing the internal validation you sought externally, reduces the compulsion to negotiate for acceptance. The inner voice that once demanded explanations can learn to trust outcomes if you give it corrective experiences. You can alter others' perception rapidly through your physiology. Slower breathing, steady posture, and a measured tone communicate calmness far more efficiently than long justifications. These cues reduce others' anxiety and lower the compulsion to insist on an immediate verbal accounting. Consider a leader who weathered a divisive reorganization by documenting the plan, executing steadily, and resisting real-time justifications. Initially, colleagues clamored for explanations, but the consistent flow of measurable results shifted attention away from motive toward effect. Over time, the metrics did the rhetorical work the leader refused to perform verbally. There's a moral line. Silence is strategy, not silence is cover. Withholding information to protect self-interest at the expense of others is misuse. The discipline I'm recommending is about clarity and integrity, choosing not to perform justifications that obscure the work, and not about hiding facts that matter to people's safety or dignity. A practical move you can try tonight is a tiny pre-commitment. Identify one interaction tomorrow where you will intentionally minimize explanation and visualize how you'll be present instead. Pre-commitment harnesses the same psychological architecture that supports all effective habit change. You remove ambiguity and make restraint a deliberate act rather than a reflex. When you make restraint habitual, the social dynamics around you change. Some relationships that depended on your willingness to justify will fade. Others will deepen because they were always built on substance. That thinning is a feature, not a bug. You recalibrate your network toward people who value you for what you do, not for how loudly you defend it. Here's a paradox most people miss. Refusing endless explanation doesn't render you opaque. It makes you legible in time. People begin to read you by pattern, not by episode. But there is one more reframing, the psychological fulcrum that transforms quiet into charisma and turns restraint into magnetic presence. And a simple daily ritual that rewires your inner narrator. If you're curious about that final pivot, stay with me. The last step completes the strategy in a way that will feel as inevitable as it is surprising. The final pivot, I promise, is deceptively simple. Design a daily ritual that turns your inner defender into an inner witness, so that your first instinct is to produce evidence, not to preemptively explain it away. Call it the evidence ritual if you like, something you do every morning that orients your day toward visible output and away from the conversational treadmill of justification. Begin the ritual by choosing one tiny, measurable thing you will complete before lunch, something you can point to, screenshot, or timestamp. The smaller, more concrete, the better. Scale makes the habit fragile. But a single finished artifact is a powerful chemical and social signal. You want the day to start with proof, not with a debate about intention. Immediately after you decide, write a 2-line declaration for yourself. One line states the specific deliverable. The second line affirms your refusal to trade energy for explanation that day. This second line is not theater. It's a cognitive cue that halves the impulse to defend and doubles the impulse to produce. You're teaching your nervous system a new rule. Before you announce anything publicly, make the artifact real. Finish it, save it, and create a minimal defensible record, a file saved, a photo taken, a commit pushed, a note published. That tangible breadcrumb is what breaks the compulsion to narrate process. It's what transforms anxiety into a concrete object others can evaluate without your commentary. Resist the urge to narrate the why immediately. Delay any contextualization for 24 hours if you can, or until there is a clear, valuable reason to explain. The pause is a diagnostic tool. If urgency to explain still exists after the artifact is visible, you'll know your motive is personal anxiety, not public necessity, and you can treat it accordingly. Use a trusted accountability anchor, a single person, a private group, or a timestamped journal, rather than broadcasting to feed the dopamine of affirmation. Accountability that's focused on outcomes, not applause, trains you to seek verification through work. The anchor will notice patterns and help you calibrate when explanations are actually required. Create a public ledger if your context benefits from it, a weekly thread, a documented changelog, a shared folder. The ledger does the rhetorical work for you in advance. People learn to go to the artifact instead of to you. That structural change shifts the conversational economy. Questions about motive become requests to see evidence. When someone presses you in real time, offer a short, composed bridge instead of a sprawling defense. A gentle line like, I'm focusing on delivering this now. I'll share context if it's helpful after I finish. Deflects without dismissing. That bridge preserves relationships while preserving your capacity to produce. Recognize what you're retraining inside yourself. The compulsion to convert uncertainty into words. Your brain learned that words can reduce social threat. Now you train it to know that completed work reduces it more reliably. The ritual creates a new reward schedule. Completion followed by selective disclosure rather than disclosure followed by fragile reassurance. This ritual is not secrecy, it's prioritized clarity. You will still explain when truth or safety requires it, but you will stop treating explanations as first aid for emotional discomfort. When the world needs moral accountability, you provide it. When the world wants performance theater, you give them results instead. There is a practical psychological trick embedded here. By making evidence your currency, you starve the explanatory habit of its market. If people can check the ledger and find consistent artifacts, their demand for continuous narratives decreases. Social environments tend to match the medium of exchange. Change the medium, change the economy of explanation. You will face resistance from two sources: your inner voice craving immediate relief and external actors who have benefited from your prior willingness to explain. The former softens with practice and the reinforcement of small wins. The latter adjusts or prunes itself as they either learn to read artifacts or lose interest in your running commentary. To make the evidence ritual stick, design micro-friction against explanations. Draft an email response template that delays explanation until after the deliverable is shared. Use scheduled sends, auto-replies, or a simple keyboard shortcut for the phrase, I'll share the results by a time to buy you the pause you need. There's a social elegance in being deliberately concise. When you choose to be short and contain your reasons, people often fill the gap with generosity and curiosity rather than suspicion. Social systems prefer to resolve uncertainty in efficient ways. But calibration matters. Being curt in the wrong arena can be interpreted as evasive, so learn the cues. If someone keeps pushing you for reasons, train a rerouting question that clarifies their need. Ask what outcome they're worried about or what consequence they hope to avoid. Often the interrogator isn't seeking truth, they're seeking assurance. Identifying that allows you to provide practical mitigation rather than a philosophical defense. Teach your team to value artifacts by changing meeting norms. Make brief show and tell slots non-negotiable. Shorten status updates to a handful of measurable outcomes and reward finished work with visibility. Over time, the group will normalize relying on output than on streams of explanation. Your posture matters. A steady tone, relaxed shoulders, and even breathing during a tense exchange reduce your impulse to over-explain and lower the listener's defensiveness. Presence is persuasive in a way words rarely are. The physical habit of calmness is as important as the cognitive habit of restraint. There's a humility advantage here. When you stop explaining, you stop performing competence through rhetoric. That vulnerability can make you more approachable and more trustworthy because people detect that you're surrendering the need to be seen as perfect and instead offering testable work. If you work in a field that demands transparency, journalism, healthcare, governance, translate the ritual into accountable processes rather than silence. Publish your methods, make your data accessible, and provide timelines for follow-up. The ritual adapts. It isn't an excuse for secrecy. It's a commitment to show responsibly. Use small experiments to expand your comfort zone. Choose one social setting per week where you'll deliberately minimize explanation and record what happens. Is the meeting less dramatic? Do conversations calm down? Does your energy improve? The evidence you collect is data you can use to refine the ritual, build an internal metric for conversational restraint, track the number of times you felt the urge to explain and the number of times you refrained. Over weeks, the ratio becomes a proxy for growing self-trust. You'll notice patterns, times of day, people, or topics that trigger you, and those patterns tell you how to intervene upstream. When you do need to explain, make the explanation surgical. Start with the impact, what happened, and who it affected, follow with a concise cause, and end with a concrete corrective action. Audiences respond to this economy. Long wind-ups invite counter-arguments and reopen debates you don't want to relitigate. Practice a humility script that keeps dignity intact. I don't have a full explanation right now, but here's what I'm doing to address it. That phrasing acknowledges concern, affirms agency, and avoids slipping to confession or justification. It's short, clear, and actionable. The evidence-first approach is particularly powerful in creative work. Instead of narrating process, show a finished draft, a demo, or a prototype. Allow others to engage with the object and then ask questions. Curiosity directed at the artifact produces richer and more useful feedback than curiosity directed at your motives. There will be relational fallout. People who relied on your explanations to feel important or secure may resist. Accept that some relationships will reorganize. That pruning is a natural consequence of aligning your life with what you value most. Clarity, autonomy, and generated value over persuasive narratives. If you're a parent or mentor, teach the ritual in mini, form to those you guide. Encourage children to show a finished core, to submit a completed assignment before explaining why they chose that method, or to demonstrate responsibility through action. Modeling the behavior is the fastest way to teach it. Avoid using the ritual as a shield for avoidance. Silence that conceals harm or evades responsibility is misuse. The evidence ritual presumes accountability. It's not an asylum for neglect. If you've caused real damage, offer a brief admission, outline reparative steps, and then follow through with visible change. Use time to your advantage. If a transaction or conversation is emotionally charged, postpone substantive explanation until after physiological arousal subsides. Time gives everyone the ability to interpret an artifact rationally rather than to judge a person in the throes of emotion. The ritual rewires not just what others expect of you, but how you talk to yourself. Over time, your internal dialogue shifts from a plea, please understand me, to a process. I will show you. That internal shift reduces anxiety because it converts external uncertainty into internal competence. When faced with an urgent why in public spaces, use a public redirect, thank the asker, note the importance, and say you'll publish an update with the facts by a specific time. This communicates respect and professional responsibility while keeping your current energy focused on completion. You will have to negotiate this change with close others. A partner who is accustomed to immediate explanations about your behavior may feel left out. Reassure them with rituals that create intimacy without erosion, schedule check-ins, offer brief context when it matters, and prioritize visible commitments that reinforce trust. In competitive spaces, silence can be a strategic cover that preserves negotiating leverage. If you're in a negotiation, reveal outcomes rather than motives. The other side can't argue with a delivered condition. This is a form of informational asymmetry used ethically. Your task is to shift the conversation toward verifiable terms. Your credibility becomes a slow currency that compounds. Each artifact you produce adds a small, accruing deposit to the ledger of your reputation. Over months and years, those deposits create a weight of proof that reduces the social appetite for your explanations and increases the default presumption of competence. A daily micro habit that pairs well with the ritual is the 1-minute summary at day's end. Capture what you finished, what you learned, and what you will do tomorrow. This short habit builds ownership and prevents the urge to explain from spilling into the next day's work. The ritual itself will evolve. Start with tiny artifacts, then scale to larger projects. As you demonstrate reliability, you'll earn the right to occasionally offer broader narratives when you choose. The trick is to let that right be earned and not assumed. If resistance rises in professional circles, allow evidence to do the talking and let your calendar speak for you. When others complain about a lack of explanation, invite them to a review session rather than dumping your process in real time. Team rituals like demos and retrospectives convert social friction into productive routines. You'll discover an unexpected side benefit. Creative confidence blooms when you spend more time finishing and less time justifying. The craft improves because you iterate on products, not on narratives. The work matures faster, and your sense of mastery grows in a grounded way. There's a final rhetorical tool to master the compact apology. When things go wrong, offer a brief, honest admission of impact, a clear plan to fix it, and an offer to be accountable. That short structure rebuilds trust more reliably than a lengthy catalog of reasons and reduces the need for you to keep explaining afterward. For those who worry about appearing cold, remember that the form of your action communicates warmth as well as competence. Showing up, delivering, and following through is an act of care. People notice consistent reliability almost as much as they notice gracious words. If you're managing a team, consider a ritual that flips the default status updates. Lead with accomplishments, not intentions. When everyone learns to announce outcomes first, the group conversation becomes less speculative and more grounded. You will reduce noise and increase collective focus. There will be moments when explanation is necessary for relationship repair or ethical transparency. In those moments, apply the same economy, concise facts, observable impacts, and clear remediation. People are often hungrier for restitution than for rationalization. When the inner critic screams that you must prove yourself with words, let the ritual answer through action. Over time, your inner voice will recalibrate not because you silenced it, but because you trained it with repeatable experiences where doing the work resolved anxieties more effectively than explanations ever did. If you want to test the transformation publicly, pick one project that has high visibility and refuse to explain in the run up. Let the release speak. Track the commentary, the metrics, and your own emotional climate. The experiment will show you how much of your previous labor went into defending rather than building. You'll discover another practical shift. Your time becomes a more reliable signal of priorities. People learn to predict how you will allocate attention based on what you produce, not on how eloquently you announced intentions. That predictability increases trust and reduces second guessing. Make a small ceremony to mark the beginning and end of a production phase. A short walk, a moment of quiet, a pen stroke. These acts create psychological separation between justification and creation. Rituals are not superstition. They are cognitive signals that prepare your brain for different modes of operation. If you're tempted to use silence as a way to dodge conflict, check your motives against 3 criteria. Does the silence protect me from accountability? Does it create harm by omission, or does it preserve the integrity of the work? If the silence fails any of these tests, speak. The discipline is ethical, not evasive. There's a cultural piece to this. Different groups expect different rhythms of explanation. Learn the norms of your environment, then nudge them gradually. Radical silence in the wrong context looks like obstinacy. Strategic restraint in the right context looks like leadership. One small tool to reduce the compulsion to explain is to keep a why log. When you notice the urge to explain, write down the instinct and its trigger. Over time, you'll see patterns and learn to intervene earlier by shifting the environment rather than by offering reasons. As your practice deepens, you'll notice people start to assume your competence before you speak. They'll ask for permission to view artifacts, request updates on projects, and treat your silence as a signal rather than a gap. That change feels subtle at first and then unmistakably liberating. The main psychological revelation is this: explanation is a social strategy born of scarcity, the belief that you must convince others to get what you need. When you cultivate abundance and evidence, that strategy becomes obsolete. You no longer compete for understanding, you earn respect through visible results. This work changes how you inhabit power. Power exercised through persuasion requires endless performance. Power rooted in proven capability requires maintenance, but much less dramatization. You conserve emotional bandwidth and create freedom to pursue work that matters to you. If you try the evidence ritual and it changes nothing, you've learned something valuable. Perhaps the people around you are asking for reasons because the stakes are truly high. Or perhaps your artifacts aren't yet persuasive. Both are useful diagnostics that guide your next choices. Tonight, pick one small deliverable you can finish before tomorrow's end. Commit to the ritual and observe what happens when you trade words for work. Notice the effect on your mood, on the responses you get, and on how much of your life you spent defending versus doing. If this conversation has shifted anything for you, consider making a public experiment. Tell one trusted person that you will focus on making and not explaining for a week, and ask them to check the ledger. Social support short-circuits old habits and accelerates the new ones. You don't have to become silent forever. You simply have to become strategic about where you spend your breath. Life rewards clarity and punishes performative justification. When you align your energy with artifacts instead of arguments, you create a life that's easier to live in and harder for others to misinterpret. I'll leave you with this: the world is a slow reader. It prefers patterns to pamphlets. If you want to be understood in the most durable way, stop trying to be convincing in the moment and become consistently undeniable over time. Let the artifacts of your life do the speaking. If that idea resonates, try the ritual tonight and watch what happens. If you found this useful, please like the video and subscribe for more conversations about clarity, presence, and influence. Drop a comment sharing one small thing you'll finish tomorrow without explaining. And if you want to follow up, watch the video on designing feedback loops to amplify your evidence.